ever since October the 7th, we've seen how the mainstream media have been reporting on Gaza. Unsurprisingly, they sided with the military occupation against the defenseless civilian population. We saw how many politicians raced to show which one was more loyal to the Zionist entity.
Israel has the right and the responsibility to defend itself. I would tell him to smoke those terrorists on this southern border.
Finish the job once and for all.
Finish them. Finish them.
We're in a religious war here. I am with Israel. Do whatever the hell you have to do to defend yourself. Level the place.
The UK's steadfast support as Israel defends itself. We will do everything that we can to help.
Many Western nations sent weapons without delay. They provided billions of dollars to the Zionist entity to compensate for the October 7th operation, and billions more in arms. The Zionist entity took all that money and weapons and started committing a genocide in broad daylight. Yet, despite all of the support, money, and weapons this entity is getting, and even though they are the ones who have targeted hospitals, civilians, and refugee camps, the mainstream media always showed this genocidal entity as the victim. Yes, apparently the victim is the one that puts 2.5 million civilians in an open-air prison for 17 years, then blocks water, food, and electricity from reaching them. Anyone who does this is no victim. But media is magic. The mainstream media did everything within their power to make this psychopath look innocent. But what's interesting is that as this genocide unfolded, some, not a lot, but some reports from the mainstream media started exposing this murderous entity masquerading as the victim. So why are we seeing some news outlets reporting on stories that are not favorable for this apartheid regime? But before I go into it, please like, share, and subscribe. Giant mainstream news outlets like the BBC and CNN were notorious for putting out news headlines that were clearly one-sided. When it comes to the Israelis, they are innocent civilians who were clearly targeted by terrorists. But when it comes to Palestinians, they unfortunately died. We don't know how they just died. When Israeli hostages get released, they show the crying father embracing his daughter. But when Palestinian civilian hostages are released, we hear. But both CNN and BBC started making reports that are not favorable for the Zionist entity. For example, CNN exposed how the IDF is desecrating cemeteries. They bulldozed more than a dozen cemeteries, first claiming they were looking for buried hostages. But when that didn't fly, they claimed there were tunnels running under the cemeteries.
These were all graves. This was a cemetery, but the military says that they were forced to come in here because they discovered a Hamas tunnel running right underneath that cemetery.
CNN in this report did actual journalism and didn't take the word of the IDF.
But the Israeli military failed to prove that stunning claim during a 3-hour tour of the area.
BBC were allowed to see the so-called Hamas headquarters command center in Al-Shifa hospital. But interestingly, they too expressed doubt when they met the IDF. They showed a bunch of weapons near an MRI machine. Yes, because it's completely safe to operate an MRI machine with a bunch of bullets and guns nearby. The BBC basically said they only had the word of the IDF, but nothing else, proving that this was a command center.
Israel is adamant this hospital was a command center, but for now at least, it's either not found supporting evidence or it's not sharing it.
So why? Why are some mainstream news outlets reporting stories that seem to only harm Israel? Did they finally see the light? Did their eyes open to the truth? Or maybe they had a change of heart after they saw all of the Palestinian civilian deaths. Maybe they finally couldn't live with themselves and they just had to do the right thing. The sad truth is that they are no different from before. Ever since the Zionist state started carrying out this genocide, the people realized a disconnect between social media and the mainstream media. It was as if they were covering completely different events. Even though the social media has been heavily censored in favor of Israel, people still have access to some facts on the ground. The IDF themselves were spreading videos of how proud they were destroying universities, mosques, and hospitals.
זה היה האוניברסיטה,
שצה"ל עזר להם זה נהיה האוניברסיטה הפתוחה.
המקרה הכי טוב לארון קבורה כזה או אחר. אני אישית גאה בהריסות של עזה
We're looking for babies, but there is no babies left.
What babies?
But whenever you turn to the mainstream media, you will realize that these companies are completely detached from reality. It's like they are on a different planet. So pretending social media does not exist damages the reputation of these companies. You see, both CNN and BBC don't care much about journalistic integrity. They are tools. I'm not saying they do zero journalism. A journalist is able to do their job within a frame of guidelines. If the journalist ventures in areas that don't serve the interest of the company, then they are stopped and put back in their place. And it's not like these companies had no idea what was happening before. They knew from day one what was happening. Let's remember what happened. Israel cut off water, food, medicine, and electricity to the entire civilian population of Gaza. They called them human animals.
We are putting a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no gas. It's all closed. We're fighting animals and are acting accordingly.
Israel denied any aid from reaching Gaza. What does that mean? It means Israel was actually planning to starve 2.5 million people. The only reason 2.5 million people are not dead is because of massive protests that led to political pressure on Israel to allow some food and water to go in, even though it's not much. But the initial plan was not to let anything in. So let's take a moment again and think about this. If Israel was not pressured and they were left to do whatever they wanted, today 2.5 million people would have died from starvation. They were seriously planning on committing one of the biggest genocides in modern times. This should have caused an uproar in the media. It didn't. The mainstream media was way too busy defending the indefensible. So if they already knew what this genocidal maniac was about to do, why do they offer reports that are damaging to Israel? The answer is simple, and it's two parts. The first part is that you are much more effective if you appear to be a neutral party when delivering the news. In other words, if I tell you, hey, I'm not on any side here, I'm just here to tell you what happened, you are much more likely to believe me as opposed if I clearly showed my bias towards a side. So if I try to say CNN has a clear Israeli bias, they could respond by saying, well, we do bring pro-Palestinian guests. You can have a pro-Palestinian guest from time to time, but still be biased. In this interview, Anderson Cooper is very much biased, but he is very subtle about it. Here, he interviews a doctor who worked for Doctors Without Borders. She tries to describe the suffering of the people of Gaza, but he keeps steering the interview away from the people of Gaza and towards her own struggle for survival. He wants this interview to be about her, not the Palestinian people. At one point, she describes how she had to get out of Gaza or else she would have died. Through his deceptive questioning, he attempted to fool the audience into believing that the reason she was about to die is because of the Palestinian peoples were about to kill her.
You said if it wasn't for your national staff, you think you would have been killed by people who were just desperate.
She clarifies that she was about to die from starvation because there was no food or water in Gaza.
We either would have starved to death or run out of water.
He quickly steers the conversation back to her struggle and how she managed to get out, not about how the Palestinians are struggling to survive this genocide. So although these companies are biased in favor of Israel, they are able to claim they are neutral by occasionally reporting on stories that are not favorable to Israel. The second reason is that you don't want to look completely detached from reality. For example, when horrendous videos of Israeli soldiers videotaping themselves bombing mosques, schools, and hospitals, the media outlets sometimes reported these instances, but they also had to add damage control. Some analysts have said the videos we see from Israeli soldiers is supported by the Israeli government, and they are supposed to give the Israeli public the image that we are in control.
The overarching theme is that, we're here, we're going to win,
We're powerful enough.
In other words, you were not supposed to see those videos. They were meant for local consumption. So what happens if you fail to convince the audience that you are neutral and that you are not detached from reality? What happens is that you will turn into a meme. Take Piers Morgan, for example. He tried to convince his audience that he is neutral. He miserably failed at it. Whenever he had Palestinian guests, he would often interrupt them and was quite aggressive towards them.
Will you let me answer fully? Yes, I'm asking you to let me finish.
They don't.
I asked you to let me finish, and I'm going to...
You've got to answer questions.
I will answer the question. Not a very unusual...
In May 2023,
No, I have to... No,
I'm going to ask you another question.
You did not give me the courtesy.
You know why? Because your answers were so outrageous.
You censor. That's your
answers you made.
Well, you don't give me the chance to say.
No, I've heard your answers.
No, you didn't.
Oh, I have.
You didn't.
I have. People have to be given the same human rights.
You do me the respect.
They have to be given. No, I will interrupt you. It's not your show. You don't just talk forever.
Well,
you're a doctor, man.
It's appalling.
You're a doctor in the NHS. What do you mean if?
Population.
I can share your concerns about what's happened.
You know you don't.
Oh, no, I do.
No,
I do.
16 years. 16
I cannot
years
believe a doctor is saying the word 16. If people got victims of if October the 7th. How can you say that?
But pro-Israeli guests were left unchallenged.
A Holocaust survivor. I mean, this is really...
I saw the footage of that woman who'd survived the Holocaust being taken away, and all I was struck by was she was completely calm. She was staring ahead, and she wasn't giving them.
And let's not forget the most important question he had just had asked his guests.
Will you now take the opportunity to condemn what Hamas did on October the 7th? I only ask you one more time. I've asked a lot of guests these two questions, and I'll be curious about your answer. Would you condemn Hamas for what they did? Do you condemn what Hamas did that day? Do you unreservedly condemned what Hamas did on October the 7th? Have you?
Of course I have, on every...
And do you unreservedly condemn? But happy to publicly condemn 9/11. Why are you not happy to condemn Israel's 9/11?
This is why he turned into a meme. His actions became counterproductive. This is why even Pierce, in an interview, admitted that Israel is occupying Gaza.
And it's undeniable that there's been an occupation.
Yeah.
And we know that because when this latest war started, the fact that Israel was able to turn on the taps of energy and water, fuel and so on, the fact they could do that, stop the food coming in and out, that is what an occupation involves. It means you control somewhere, which is not legally yours to control.
Majority of Muslims polled were convinced that he was just an Islamophobe, especially after the interview with the Muslim doctor. Just look at this title. After this aggressive interview, the network asked this doctor if he could come back on because they realized they were too aggressive.
Came back to me 3 days later after the show and said, our editor is wondering whether or not you'd like to come on for a less confrontational interview.
Are you serious?
Yeah. And I laughed and I said, I don't think that would be hard to get a less confrontational interview.
They also realized this amount of aggression against Muslims and pro-Palestinian guests is counterproductive. Again, like CNN and BBC, he knows very well what is happening in Gaza. He knows about the occupation, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the apartheid, and the inhumane blockade that Palestinians had to suffer long before October the 7th. He had to admit and speak negatively of Israel, not because he didn't know before, but because he was forced to admit it. This means one thing. We as viewers do have a role. We must continue to engage in this topic. We need to continue exposing the criminals committing these horrendous acts. We need to continue sharing and engaging with content that brings awareness to this issue. If these news outlets refuse to talk about what is truly happening in Gaza, then it is up to us to talk about it. YouTube will limit the exposure of this video because of their clear bias. But please share, like, and subscribe so that it could reach to as many people as possible.